Before we can look at the different types of agreements or employment contracts, a really important thing we need to know about is the Minimum Employment Standards, or the 10 NES in Australia. So what's that about? Well, as a bare minimum, every agreement or contract in Australia must meet certain minimum conditions. So things like it must meet the minimum wage, so saying it can be better than that, but it can't be less than that. It's also got to meet, these are really important, the 10 Minimum National Employment Standards, or NES. And these are set by the Fair Work Commission, who we looked at as a participant in the workplace. So the Fair Work Commission, the FWC, sets two things basically: the minimum wage per hour in Australia and the 10 National Employment Standards, or NES. And together, these two must apply to every agreement or contract as a bare minimum. Any other agreement must be better than that. And these are what we're going to call a safety net. So how is this actually set? Now, we don't need to know this. This is just some background info. So how do we get the minimum wage every year? Well, what happens is each year the Fair Work Commission creates a panel to set the minimum wage. But how do they do that? Well, they take submissions from various parties. So, for example, the unions will come up. It's in Canberra, in Australia, and the unions will go up to Canberra and they say, we think the minimum wage should be X. And then the employer associations representing the interests of employers come in and say, no, we think it should be this. But then that's not the only two groups they get feedback from. They get feedback from things like charities and community groups. So the people, because the minimum wage usually applies to people making the bare minimum, so they're the people that often have to get help from charities and community groups. So they come in and say, we think the minimum wage should be this. And then the state and federal governments also get to have their say. And what happens is the Fair Work Commission hears all these submissions and then they make a ruling. They say, after hearing all of this, the minimum wage in Australia for the next 12 months will be a certain amount. Now, and again, we don't need to know this, but it usually goes up every year, and the amount that it goes up is based on many factors. But we can see over time in the last decade, it's slowly gone up to the point where now in 2022, it's $21.38. That's for a full-time or part-time employee. And we can see some years it goes up relatively quite a bit. So from 2021 to 2022, it went up over $1 because we've got very high inflation at the moment. But you can see in 2020, it didn't go up much at all. And that was, you got to remember, during COVID. So it was very difficult to offer people a pay rise. And that's how the minimum wage is set. What about these 10 minimum national employment standards? What are they? Well, they're 10 minimum conditions that all workplace contracts must meet. There are no exceptions. An employment contract can have other conditions outside the 10, but must include the 10 standards as a bare minimum. It's kind of like the rights enshrined for every worker in 10 standards. Now, we do not need to know these, so it's not like you're going to get asked about them. It's something that would be good if you could talk about, but they're just sort of background information for when we look at the different types of agreements or contracts in the next video. But just for background, what are some of the standards? Well, they are: 1, maximum weekly hours. In Australia, it's a maximum weekly hours of 38 if you're a full-time employee, plus any reasonable additional hours. This is where disputes come in because it just says reasonable. What's reasonable? Some people work 70 hours a week. Is that reasonable? And is it different by industry? That's where, people go to court and very smart and high-paid lawyers argue the definition of reasonable. But technically, in Australia, maximum weekly hours are 38. Flexible working arrangements. Every employer has the right to request flexible working arrangements, e.g. start early, leave early, or what about now, since COVID, to work from home. So say you've got an office job that's purely based using some maybe software, you could do that anywhere. So you've got the right to request a flexible working arrangement. Parental leave. Parental and adoption leave are 12 months unpaid, with the right to request an additional 12 months. So what that means is you can take up to 24 months off, but your employer has to hold your job and you can get it back if you choose. Annual leave. In Australia, we get 4 weeks paid annual leave per year. We also put pro rata if you're part-time. So if you're just working half the time, then you would get 2 weeks. But as in Australia, we're entitled to 4 weeks paid annual leave, which we just call holidays. Personal or carers leave. We often in Australia call these sickies, but what we mean is legally you get a total of 10 days paid sick or carers leave each year. They're the main ones. We do have some other ones here about community service, like if you get on a jury, you can't be fired. You're allowed to go and be on the jury, or you get a legal duty to do that and you get paid and so on. Long service leave. Public holidays, the entitlement for an employee to be absent on public holidays and be paid their ordinary hours. For some businesses, however, like retail or hospitals that are open on public holidays, the employer may reasonably request the employee to work. Termination notice and redundancy pay, which we did in Chapter 5. And there's also this Fair Work Information Statement, which we'll look at in class. It says when hired, the employee must receive this, and all it does is it outlines all these things that we've just spoken about here. And they're the 10 National Employment Standards, or NES. Now remember, you don't need to know them individually, you just need to know that they exist, and they serve as kind of like a background or a safety net. What do we mean by that term? Well, we say the minimum wage and the 10 standards act as a safety net. So let's look at it as like a continuum here and say here's the best possible conditions for an employee that could ever be. And here's the worst possible conditions. So let's say in a job, someone says, an employer says you'll get $500 an hour, you'll only ever have to work 38 hours a week, I'll give you 12 weeks annual leave, 6 months of parental leave, and so on. So these are conditions better than average. But at the other end, what's to stop an employer going, no, I'm only going to give you $5. You're going to have to work a minimum of 50 hours. I'm not going to give you any annual leave, and I'm not going to give you any parental leave. Well, in Australia, that's illegal. And what we say is that's because there's a safety net. So assuming a worker could start at the very best, possible conditions up here, but that's not going to happen for everyone. So what would happen is the employee will fall and fall and fall and fall. What's to stop them falling all the way down to these horrible conditions there? Something we call the safety net. And that was, in Australia, this safety net right here says minimum $21 whatever an hour, plus maximum 38 hours a week, 4 weeks of annual leave, and so on. And that's what we call the safety net. So the safety net is the minimum wage and the 10 standards. They kind of prop up here. And if you go to the circus and watch a trapeze artist, if they fall, what catches them? That big net. That's what this acts as well. So the main thing here is not to know the individual things that make up the 10 national employment standards and exactly what the minimum wage is. You don't need to know that. You just need to know that they exist. And they serve as this safety net to catch all workers in Australia. So their contracts must have that as the bare minimum terms and conditions.